Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by author Thomas Yeggy. He is the author of Mushroom Cloud, book one of the First Strike series. This book has main character is Caleb Young, a seasoned chief CIA scientist who has served as a nuclear diplomacy advisor and is dealing with the heady days of the early days of the Cold War. Um, and I thought this would be interesting because we are just now getting to a place where we're having books and things come out about the Cold War. We've kind of gotten over our obsession with World War II, and now we're moving on to what is, in my opinion, the much more interesting stuff of the 20th century, dealing with the Cold War. So, welcome, Tom, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Excellent. So, why don't we begin from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about yourself and about your book.
Um, I am a 1976 graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law. I have undergraduate degrees in psychology and English. I have advanced writing courses from the University of Iowa, and I have practiced law in the Davenport, Iowa, Rock Island, Illinois area for the last 46 years and wanted to uh, delve into the military aspects of the Cold War, primarily because I lived through the Cold War. I can remember huddling under a desk in the fifth and sixth grade when the great Russian Empire was going to strike back at us. The Sputnik uh, ding, ding, ding that was going across the sky was a very uh, signal event that kept us on our toes. It started the scientific revolution in the United States. And I think that Dr. James Killian, Eisenhower's chief scientist, was responsible for creating the Lincoln Project that involved 42 different scientists that contributed to the effort to make sure that the United States was not subject to a surprise attack. As a matter of fact, there's a point in, I believe, book two, Finding Designated Ground Zero, where the scientists meet with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they were amazed and basically said, here we were, a bunch of science geeks meeting with the military men who had enough ribbons on their chests to start an Easter parade, and
Mhm.
they had no idea about the defense of the United States and whether we would be facing another Pearl Harbor. We have to remember at that time, too, the Russians had fired off several ICBM missiles, and our first try at launching an ICBM missile ended up in failure. The missile blew up, somewhere about 150 miles or less off of the launching pad. So uh, I became interested in that area, but was too busy practicing law to go ahead and do much in terms of more research. But I became very interested when I ran across an individual by the name of Vasily Arkhipov. And for those who don't know who Vasily Arkhipov was, he was the captain of the B-59 Foxtrot submarine, which was escorting Soviet ships to Cuba so that they could put their medium-range ballistic missiles up at five different sites in Cuba. And on October 27th of 1962, Arkhipov faced a moment of truth. He had a nuclear-tipped torpedo in torpedo tube number 6. He was within 12,000 yards of the Essex, which was an anti-submarine aircraft carrier that had about 3,500 men on board of it, and was in position to sink that submarine. But he convinced Captain Savitsky that launching the uh, nuclear tipped torpedo at that time uh, did not comport with the orders that they had received from the Moscow High Command, their Navy leaders back there, before they had set sail on October 1st. The conditions were very deplorable inside that Foxtrot, because the Foxtrots were basically built to traverse the North Atlantic in much cooler or colder water, and the temperatures inside the B-59 reached 130 degrees in the engine room, and their desalination machine had been clogged up because of the greater salinity that is found in the Caribbean, and so they were being hit with uh, practice depth charges at 5 at a time, which was a signal, international signal, to surface. The 3 destroyers on top of them knew where they were and wanted them to surface at that time. And although they ultimately surfaced, there was a huge confrontation with Savitsky and Vasily Arkhipov as to whether or not the nuclear-tipped torpedo should have been fired. Now, the nuclear-tipped torpedo had a warhead of about 12 kilotons on it, which is similar to the amount that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think one of the bombs dropped there had a 12 kiloton warhead, and the other one had a 15 kiloton warhead. And the torpedo from the B-59 certainly would have ruptured the hull of the Essex, and World War III would have been on at that point.
Mm. Well, there's so many incidences of that, especially in the early days of the Cold War. So I mean, that's all fascinating, all this type of thing. So what is it when it comes to this brinksmanship between the US and Ivan, as my dad, who was in the Navy in the 80s, used to say, and all this sort of thing. What do you think is the most fascinating thing about this time in history? Because I think a lot of people, we don't really talk about the Cold War in depth. It's kind of like World War II, and then yes, the Cold War, and then the Berlin Wall comes down. It's all over. We won. So who cares? What is the most fascinating incident out of all that for you?
Well, the most fascinating incident is that we didn't blow ourselves up. Um, uh, Robert McNamara, who was
Although we
Kennedy's
might
secretary,
now, we're not doing so
yes,
well right now.
well, we can still do it, but Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, met with some of his Russian counterparts in Cuba, in Havana, in 1992. And they asked him, they said, well, how was it that you avoided nuclear war at that time? Because in addition to the uh, almost catastrophic launch of the nuclear torpedo by the B-59, we had a U-2 airplane that had strayed into Russian airspace over in Siberia, and we had scrambled some F-104s to uh, guard that particular plane, and they were armed with nuclear weapons as well. So, I mean, and Kennedy had gotten done with one of his swims down in the pool, and he was coming up, and they had told him about that, and Kennedy said, "Well, there's always some SOB that doesn't get the message," and it's the fact that there were so many close calls like that during the Cold War that really kind of uh, leaves me amazed that we didn't set off World War III. Now, when Kennedy came into office, he had a huge problem. He was Lieutenant Kennedy, and General Eisenhower had given the uh, commanders in the field carte blanche to utilize nuclear weapons, especially tactical nuclear weapons, because you have to see that the balance in Central Europe was heavily against the NATO forces. As a matter of fact, we had left only 1.5 active divisions in the Central European area or Western European area when we left, and the other European allies had maybe 3 or 4 divisions. So we're sitting there with 3 or 4 divisions, and that's basically 60,000 men or less to defend all of Western Europe. Okay. Now you have to contrast that with what the Russians had at that time in conventional weapons and their 3,000 troop support attack airplanes. They had um, 30 active divisions in Germany alone. And within 30 days, they could activate 400 divisions to make an assault across Western Europe. And the reason that they didn't was because we were able to convince them through various operations, one of which I called Shell Game and the other Anaconda. Now, Shell Game involved our Silver Plate B-29s, which were able to deliver nuclear weapons. And they were the only B-29s that were able to deliver nuclear weapons. And so uh, Truman called in the CIA, and he said, okay, we have to convince the Russians that we're serious about bombing them if with nuclear weapons, and that's the only way we can offset their huge conventional advantage that they have is if they think that we will hit them with nuclear weapons if they march on uh, France and Spain and especially West Germany, uh, and so the the game was that the 60 silver plates, of course, Truman did not want to put them in harm's way. And by transferring them over to England, the bases in England, he felt that they would be in danger of being destroyed by a blitzkrieg from the Russian forces. So he kept the Russians guessing as to where the B-29s that carried nuclear weapons were actually located. And in Mushroom Cloud, I call that the shell game. And that's one of the first operations that the CIA, the newly minted CIA, which was created in 1947, undertook. Now, the other operation that they undertook was called Anaconda, which was a uh, kind of an operation that the senior Air Force Board and Stuart Symington, who was the Secretary of the Air Force, undertook, and it was something that within the book itself the Department of Justice attorney who's questioning Caleb and gets really upset about. And I'm going to just give you a little background on the my protagonist, Dr. Caleb Young, and William Ford, the Department of Justice person. I set the series up as a frame story. And basically, I've been enthralled with frame stories because of, books like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad and, movies like Forrest Gump. And I just like frame stories. So I set it up as a frame story. And I go through Caleb Young's educational process just briefly. His parents were part of the Magyarization process in Hungary, where they were Jewish scientists, and the Hungarian process was that you had to change your name from a Jewish name to a non-Jewish name to get a job even in Hungary. And okay, so we've got the Jewish problem now, which we can talk about later in this podcast if you want to. But what's going on over in the Mid East, which might set off World War III. But anyway, they came to the United States in about 1919, 1920, and Caleb was maybe 1 or 2 years old. And came Caleb's father was about 6'8", and he was a physicist that had taken part in some of the lectures over in Germany at their chief scientific area in Germany. And Anna, his mother, was a chemist, and they homeschooled uh, Caleb, and he was very interested in science, but didn't want anything to do with philosophy or any of the other softer sciences. He was all about atomic theory and all of the things that were going on. And in my book, I describe the atomic theory and how it developed in hopefully layman's terms so that people can understand it. Uh, and so Caleb's educated that way. He goes to Princeton, and the only way that he got into Princeton was, I'm kind of sounding off my egalitarian principles at this point. The Scholastic Aptitude Test came out in 1936. Just conveniently for me, it fit into my time frame. And so I went ahead and had Caleb, of course, my fictional protagonist, take the SAT test. And of course, since I modeled him after Will Hunting in the movie Good Will Hunting, he was, as McGeorge Bundy described him, the brightest person on the planet. And of course, he aced the SAT test, got into Princeton, got his PhD by the time he was his doctorate by the time he was 18, and went on to the State Department. And from there, he worked on the Manhattan Project. And now the other fictional character, William Ford, was the head of his class at at Harvard Law School, and was also a psychiatrist. And so they brought Caleb in after Kennedy was assassinated, and they wanted to get as much information from Caleb as they could because Nicholas Katzenbach, the Department of Justice, he was the assistant to Robert Kennedy, and J. Edgar Hoover wanted to bring down the CIA and all the money that they were getting. So the story starts out there, and when they get to the part of the story where William Ford from the Department of Justice is asking Caleb about this Anaconda project that the CIA was running. Caleb, is asked well, who were the targets of this operation? And uh, Caleb responded to Ford by saying that, well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the national security establishment were the targets of this operation. And so Ford explodes at that time. He says, so you're telling me that the CIA, within a couple years or 3 years of their initiation, ran a project and sought to deceive Truman and the national security establishment and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Caleb said, "Well, yes, that was the case." And the reason that they felt that it was necessary to do that was because they needed to convince the Russians that the B-36 bomber, and the B-36 is one of the key elements in Book One, that the B-36 bomber was a viable intercontinental bomber. And to do that, they had to uh, meet with the Caleb had to meet with the senior Air Force board, and they had to do what I call shading of the envelope curves. Now, the envelope curves are uh, actually uh, performance metrics for the B-36. And now the B-36 was actually a terrible airplane. And the B-36, but it was a huge airplane. It was 230 feet of wingspan. So if you're sitting at a football stadium and you're looking at 80 yards, the wingspan was almost 80 yards. It had six 3,800 horsepower engines. And when it was fully loaded, it weighed more than 20 tons. That's like 6 semis going down the road. And so it was enormously underpowered, and it was supposed to be an intercontinental bomber, and the only way they could get it off the ground were with jet assist pods. And so Caleb, who of course, being the brightest person on the planet, while he was in Washington D.C. working for the CIA, took a job at Catholic University and became an accomplished aerospace engineer also.
Yes, I
Uh,
believe that that plane is in that movie with Jimmy Stewart, Strategic Air Command.
yes, it is. It is,
Yes.
and
If
quite
listener,
frank,
if you haven't gone and watched that movie, it is one, a great movie, but two, the footage of that bomber, I don't know who pulled strings of the Pentagon to get that footage, but it is genuinely beautiful, incredibly well shot. And you will get to see the full six turning, four burning.
yes, yes, exactly.
um,
I,
and yeah, that's a definite. It's a good companion watch to this whole story. So
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
it is, and quite frankly, I put together a almost, and it was probably too long, but I put it on my website, and there is some footage from that movie on my video that's on the website, and the uh, B-36 had it could only go, I think, uh, like oh, I don't know how many miles, but after it had flown 2 missions, they had to change all 338 spark plugs. And one of the guys said, well, it leaked oil. We had to shut down engines. Uh, but during Truman's inauguration, this was kind of funny. Truman had served, of course, in World War One, and he had some of his people from World War One that were still friends of his, and he told them he met with them uh, at at breakfast, 6 o'clock in the morning. He said, "I don't care what you guys do today," he said, "but please stay sober until at least noon, okay? Because you're going to be in the parade." And so, in addition to that, they had the B-36 do a flyover. And it was, like I said, an enormous airplane, and it shook and shuttered the windows. And there were a lot of Soviet spies, of course, at the inauguration. And they were convinced through this Anaconda program the CIA ran, and just looking at the B-36 and how massive it was, that it could carry bombs over a 10,000-mile trip, drop them on target, and come back. And Hoyt Vandenberg and Truman and Jim Forrestal always argued about whether the B-36 was a good plane. And the Weapons Systems Evaluation Group finally came in with an analysis of this B-36. And there's a meeting that Truman's having in his office with Lewis Johnson, who was his campaign manager and attorney from Omaha. And so they're talking about this plane and about whether it can accomplish its mission. And they're reading this report from the Weapons Systems Evaluation Group, which is a terrible report on this B-36 airplane. And Lewis Johnson, of course, who would have been indicted had he served under present day circumstances with all the graft laws. He was connected very much with a lot of the corporations that had made the B-36. He said to Truman, I told you it was a good airplane, and they're saying it's a good airplane, and Truman snapped back at him and said, no, damn it. He says they're saying just the opposite. And so
Yeah.
that was the story of the B-36.
That was the
And
beginning of the military industrial complex too, but that's another story.
oh yes, yeah, and it was, but Eisenhower was such a cheapskate, and he kept such a lid on the military expenditures. He kept cutting the budget back, and but when the Russians started firing off these intercontinental ballistic missiles and Sputnik came out, then the floodgates kind of opened. In like 55, 56, there was the Gaither report, which it wasn't really the Gaither report because he got sick, and Robert Sprague and a guy named Foster, presented the Gaither report and said, hey, you've got your B-52s, parked out on runways. You've got, and they're all clustered together. They said, why don't you just invite the Russians to come in and bomb all of our B-52s in a first strike and take them out, and then we can surrender. And so this was presented at the National Security Council meeting, and the military men were all upset. And not Alan Dulles, but John Dulles, John Foster Dulles, who was kind of a rogue character in my opinion. I think there's been a book written on the two Foster brothers that's very scathing and I think very accurate. But
well, yeah, when
they
you're a
are,
former CIA director, but also mysteriously on the Warren Commission during the Kennedy
yeah,
assassination, something
yes,
is
yes,
up.
yeah.
Um,
That's something I explore. That's something I explore quite thoroughly in book 3. But one of the things that Sprague was complaining about was that he went out to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, and he wanted to, he had to present this report, and he wanted to see what kind of preparations we had so that we weren't, a victim of Pearl Harbor. And he got out there, and he didn't see anything. And they kind of treated him like a pedestrian. And so he went back and complained to Eisenhower. Eisenhower called up LeMay and said, you will show him the war room out at Offutt. And so he went back out to Offutt, and they took him into this back room where they showed all of these airplanes buzzing around the Soviet Union. And Sprague said, "Well, what's that?" And LeMay says, "Well, these are all of the Russian airplanes, and I know when they start to math them, and if they load nuclear weapons, I'm going to know that because we've got RB-47s and other planes that are flying over their bases, and they're not able to knock them down. So I know where." And so Sprague said, "Well, what are you going to do if they start uh, if they start you know massing them?" And LeMay said, "Well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to knock the crap out of them." And Sprague said, "Well, that's not our national policy." And LeMay said, "Well, that's my policy." And so he, he was
Another
he
good
was
movie if you want to see more of that, Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to, what is it? Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Quit Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Yes, yeah. Dr. Strangelove was one of the. I think it was my friend over in Cambridge just says that it's one of his top movies, top three movies, and explains that the title of it, Strange Love, is how can you love something that's going to cease your existence, on the planet, and things like that. But I go into the uh, Stalin regime quite thoroughly, and uh, posit an operation that he had called Operation Mighty Handful. And uh,
Before we get into all of that, we've gone
yes,
deep into the Cold War and all this type of thing. Um, we're talking about this first. So there's three books in the series. Then
correct.
okay, cool. Excellent. So and then the time period kind of goes from the end of World War II, and the series stops about when?
The series stops right after the Cuban Missile Crisis is resolved, and LeMay screaming at Kennedy that we lost, uh, because he wanted a war while we had such a numerical advantage in deliverable weapons. And
Mm.
it stops there, but there is a like the last 50 pages I devote to a war between China and the United States that takes place during 2028. And we can go into that later if you want to, but that's where uh, that's where I take you throughout all three books.
Yeah, well, we know well we've been at this for a little bit, so we really should fast forward to today. I don't think um possibly since 1962 that we have ever been closer to the real reality of nuclear weapons exchange because of our present geopolitical situation. Um, and there's
Oh yes,
plenty of options on the table. And I think most worrying and most concernedly, and nobody really talks about this, but the entire treaty structures that have reduced nuclear weapons and stopped them from proliferating and limited their use is basically gone since the Ukraine war has started. So we've lost decades of progress there. And we kind of start to wonder, at what point does Putin get desperate? And for me, understanding old Soviet technology, my other question is, how reliable are those missiles? You know, if they push the button, will anything actually happen? Will they blow up in their silos? Will they blow up in midair? I mean, it could become utter chaos.
well, the Russians are, in my opinion, a very inept military forces, as has been proven in the Ukraine. Okay, now
They don't
whether
have it
that's
together. It's not like the old days.
no, no, they would have cleaned up according to Zukov, uh, they could have marched to the sea in 7 days at the end of World War II, and or like maybe not during at the end of World War II, but they were talking maybe 1951. Um, they could have gone to the sea with their conventional forces. Now their conventional forces are a mere shadow of their former self, of course. But
Well, and the grift has been so terrible. You have tanks with no equipment. You have food that's expired because the oligarchs have sucked up all the money, so things have not been maintained. Um, and it's kind of amazing over the last year how they have started to figure out a lot of those things. But that war, the lines are not moving. It's become a Sitzkrieg, and that's why I worry, particularly with tactical weapons. At what point does Putin start to get impatient? Supposedly
well,
he's dying.
yes. Now,
Supposedly. So
well,
what one starts
but
to wonder, when is he going to get desperate, and all of a sudden you have nuclear armed artillery in the field that could, that could
well,
get dangerous very quickly.
I do a deep dive into what's called Project Vita, which was headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, and the Oppenheimer movie's been out. But I do a fairly deep dive in book one as to the various tactical nuclear weapons that could be employed uh, over in Germany, and there were several studies about what would happen if the U.S. employed some of their cannons that could shoot 12 kiloton nuclear weapons 20 miles, and some of the other short range ballistic missiles that could deliver 200 kiloton bombs 200 miles apart. And they just decided that it was going to be just a total wipeout in terms of the environment and everything that was associated with it. So I think that yeah, there's a real danger that Putin becomes frustrated and just says, okay, I'm going to take over Kiev, and I'm going to take over, some of the other major cities. And to do that, all I have to do is shoot off a few of our tactical nuclear weapons. I think, though, there's a book out by Mark Trachtenberg which talks about the escalation ladder. So what happens next is the question. Okay, suppose Putin uses nuclear weapons in the Ukraine, then I think that from what I've read and studied, that the next move is a sinking of all of the ships in the Black Sea fleet that the Russians have. So, I mean, uh, then okay,
And based
and
upon
as
how that's been going so far, it doesn't seem like that would take very long.
no, it certainly wouldn't. But during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, um, the it was I think it was in this book by Fred Kaplan that I wrote, or not that I wrote, of course, but that I read, called "The Wizards of Armageddon." And Dean Acheson comes into the executive committee room, and he says he's talking about well, he says, I know the Soviet Union well. I know what they will do. And I would think that if we knock out their missiles in Cuba, that they'll knock out ours in Turkey. And then when one of the other people on the executive committee says, well, what will they do then? Atchison replied, I believe that under our NATO treaty with which I'm associated, we would be required to respond by knocking out a missile base inside the Soviet Union. Well, what will they do then? Someone said. Atchison said, well, that's when we hope, he answered, that cooler heads will prevail and that they will stop and talk. So you're talking about the escalation ladder there, which Atchison was talking about. And I'm convinced that, once the genie's out of the bottle, that we have some real problems. And that's when I start going to my blog site or my website, and in particular the blog that says how to survive a nuclear war. So that's one of the characteristics that
Yeah, I'm
uh,
less concerned with ICBMs because I think that stash is old. It's Soviet made. I think half the missiles will blow up in the silos before they even get off the ground. And I think missile defense would take care of most of the rest. But then again, I also live on the East Coast, so cold comfort. Um, I'm much more concerned about things like the tactical nukes that are smaller, less complicated, easier to maintain, probably still work.
yeah,
Ship-based missiles and things that are probably in reasonably good repair or have been somewhat modernized. There was a modernization campaign in the 90s, early 2000s, at the end of Yeltsin, beginning of Putin. A lot of that stuff probably still works. Um, that I think is quite concerning, but it's also a matter of escalation on our side as well. I think it would be very difficult once that trigger is pulled. There's going to be very little resistance on this side to responding in kind. The only upside is that we wouldn't no longer have global warming. We would have nuclear
well,
winter.
yeah. Well, uh, the problem that I see is like you say, I'm not so concerned about the ICBMs. I'm more concerned about the SLBMs, the submarine launched ballistic missiles that the Russians have. They have 5 or 6 nuclear submarines that are really, I think, capable and up to date. And
Yes,
those would
and very
be,
sophisticated. Those
yes,
technologies are much closer to ours than anything else. And I agree with you. That's a huge concern. And for mid-range, that's Europe,
right.
Mediterranean, yes, very concerning.
Yeah, that's one of the major concerns. And uh, when I get involved with our anti-ballistic missile system, I do a very detailed deep dive in book 3 into our anti-ballistic missile system, and go through the not only the uh, the the mid range, but I also do what's called the boost phase intercept, and I theoretically place uh, a lot of what are called the SM-6s and SM-2 missiles over in Mongolia, which I find a province in Mongolia, and I find that Mongolia is very anti-Chinese because of the fact that the Chinese have taken over outer Mongolia, and they've introduced their language into the schools and everything else. And so I kind of, in that part of the book, I'm able to convince readers, I believe, that the Mongolian government would be receptive to us placing uh, what are called ballistic phase intercepts, which are very near the new silos that the Chinese are building in northeast China. And uh, the ballistic phase intercepts, of course, are followed by the mid-course intercept, which are basically placed on all of our Aegis ships that we have, destroyers and cruisers. And I think that from what I've seen lately, uh, those particular mid-course intercepts and terminal phase intercepts, which we have based on ships that are closer to our shores, could do a fairly decent job. And in this particular book, there's a conference between Xi Jinping and Putin, and Putin is warning he talks to his scientific advisors, and he's warning Xi. He says, "Don't start a nuclear war with the United States. If you're the one that starts it, we're going to knock down your missiles." And Xi gets really upset with that answer, and the people on his military council are telling him, you can't fire these missiles at the United States. And make a long story short, he does. And our anti-ballistic missile system is dealing with, I think, 166 incoming missiles, and I explain how that can or can't be handled in the book. Just a spoiler alert. I'm not going to tell you how that comes out, but I come full circle at the end of book 3, and I have the a survivalist camp that's based upon Hobbesian and Platonic and Kantian rules of how a society should be set up, and that's the literary component of my book. And I tried to do that because basically, as one of the reviewers has stated, they said this isn't a casual read for anybody. It's, in other words, if you want to read a murder thriller or a mystery or a romance novel that's a page turner to see whether Jimmy's going to hook up with Jane, don't pick this book up off the shelf, because you'll be disappointed. And so that's kind of where where I've tried to come from.
No. I mean, this has been fascinating. It's a fascinating conversation. You clearly have done your research and your homework to the nth degree, and I appreciate that so much. And it's absolutely spectacular. So we've reached the part of the show where we do plugs and we find out where we can buy the book and where we can keep track of you online. So, why don't you tell us where we can find the book and how to contact you online?
Okay. I'm The books are available. The first 2 books are available today on Amazon. Okay.
Yep.
And they can be purchased either singly or together or Kindle. I do not have an audio out yet. The reviews, some of the reviews are carried on Amazon. There's, I think, 12 or 13 reviews there. But the majority of the professional reviews you'll find on my website at thomasjyeggy.com. And if someone were to just Google thomasjyeggy.com, you'll come up with a website that shows links to where the book can be bought, and it has, I think there's now been maybe 10 professional reviews of the books that have I think all of those are either, well, I think 9 out of the 10 are 5-star, and there's 1 4-star review. And I did have one disgruntled customer on Amazon. He said, "Well, this book is not about, the mushroom cloud, book 1 of the First Strike series. It's not about a first strike at all." Well, that's book 1. You know, you have to
Yeah.
read through book 3. And one of the more interesting things that I think that I'm doing now and it just fascinates me beyond belief. And I think I might have sent you a copy of Part 3A of that, and that's the Cason-Rowan plan for a preemptive, out of the blue, not a preemptive, but a preventive, out of the blue first strike against the Soviets in October of 1961. Kennedy was very frustrated with the Berlin situation in 1961, and he wanted military solutions. And so Lehman Lemonitzer, who was the Joint Chiefs of Staff guy, said, well, we'll send a battalion down the road. And Kennedy said, well, what if they get stopped? And then he says, well, we'll send a division. And then it kept going, and we'll send 3 divisions. And Kennedy said, well, they've got 120 divisions in that area that they can call up. And then he said, what's the plan if they repulse our 3 divisions? And he turned it over to Tommy Powers, who was the head of the Strategic Air Command, who even scared LeMay, and was famously said that, well, if at the end of our nuclear war, now this is the guy that was the head of our Strategic Air Command in 1961, if at the end of the nuclear war there are 2 Americans alive and 1 Russian, we've won. Okay, so yeah, I don't think that Kennedy thought that was a good outcome, but they said, well, then you'll have to send the nuclear weapons in. And Kissinger had said to McGeorge Bundy, he had said, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do if if we're faced with that nuclear moment of truth? And Kissinger had told him, he said, well, this is what nuclear war means. And Kennedy, was faced with this suicide or surrender scenario where the only military plan at that time that the military had in store for him to implement was a full PSYOP, that's single integrated option plan, PSYOP 62, which would have dropped 7,237 megatons of weapons on the Soviet Union, killing 300 million people over there, including 125 million Chinese. And General Shoup, who was the head of the Marine Corps, said, well, what about, we're bombing the Chinese and they aren't even part of this? And he says, that's not the American way. And Tommy Powers said, well, it's part of the plan, and I don't want anybody screwing with the plan because the plan can't be messed with. And so those were Kennedy's options.
Well, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast, and hopefully people will who are interested like me will go and pick up your book. So thank you so much. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.